So in the following video, I must say that I kept mispronouncing Palazzo Schifanoia as Palazzo Schifanoia. So, yeah, just a bit of note before you proceed. Hi. So one of the most awesome books that I've read lately is certainly this book right here, Alice Smith, How to Be Both. I actually finished this book like at least more than a month ago, but I've been unable to kind of make a video for this book because of time constraint. But finally, I'm able to do that, and brace yourself because it's time for, me to rave about this book. So, How to Be Both is actually my first Alice Smith book. I've never read anything by Alice Smith before, and that book totally, like literally, it floored me. Like, you can't imagine how much, how incredible that book was. I just love it so much. And I had a lot of fun reading that book. I had actually a lot of memories reading that book because I read that book at so many different places. I read that book, of course, at home. I read the book while I was having my lunch break at the office. I also read this book at a diner where I was eating noodles, and I also read this book at a cafe where I had this like really wonderful ice blended drink. In fact, I actually finished this book at that cafe, and by the time I finished this book, it was already closing time. I don't know why I included that detail, but I don't know, it just seemed really memorable. It seemed really fun. Every time I go to that cafe, I would think of this book. Like, seriously. So I just kind of wanted to talk a little bit about how I got to know this book. I was actually browsing an online store, and then I saw this book on the catalog, and it's really interesting. It has this like really interesting cover, and the reason why it really intrigued me was because the fact that, okay, first I kind of have this feeling that this book is going to be, some sort of literary fiction. But usually literary fiction, they tend to have like this kind of abstract, kind of artsy covers. They don't usually have like really concrete image, for its cover, usually, but not always, of course. And so this book, it has this image which is so precise, so detailed, so concrete as hell, and it got me interested. Like, what kind of story that it wants to tell with this photograph? Like, I didn't know what this photograph was when I saw this cover, and even until I got this book, when the order arrived, I didn't know what this picture was. But it was just so interesting. In fact, I actually thought that it really resembled this kind of stock photo that you see on language learning textbooks, stuff like that. So yeah, it's really intriguing, and it kind of made me wonder. And the title was really vague, so it made me wonder what kind of story this book is trying to tell, and it all was just really fuzzy, and it was kind of like, I would say, the first time ever where I started a book without knowing, like 0%, without knowing anything about the possible contents of this book. And it was a fresh experience, and probably that's one of the reasons why this book was such a memorable book for me, because of how I got into it. The cover, the title, the fact that I didn't know anything about the book, and it's my first time reading Alice Smith. Everything was just very special, and I must say by the time I finished reading this book, I had this like really special experience. This experience that I don't know if I would be able to kind of relive again, because the story is just so nice. So when you have a book that has a story that concerns with loss, and I can say that I already have like one foot at the door, because that's the kind of story that I usually like. Stories about loss, about grief, about relationship, and of course relationship is like really general, but loss is usually something that it's really heavy, and I'm really interested to see how the character face that kind of difficulty, that kind of struggle. It's more of a personal struggle, and loss is definitely something that is very, very important in this book. So we have this young woman, a girl in her teenage years. Her name is George, short for Georgina. I think she lives in the UK, and she just lost her mother. And so already this book starts with that note, that really sad and grieving, kind of almost mourning note. It's really interesting to see how a young person like George is trying to cope with her mother's loss, but the story is not dramatic. In fact, the way that she's coping with her loss is by trying to reconnecting with her mother, like the stuff that her mother used to be interested in while she was alive. Those were the things that George is looking for in order to kind of I think to understand her mother more, in order to be able to kind of remember her in George's own way. And so her mom actually is interested in old paintings, like for example Renaissance paintings, those sort of stuff. And another thing that her mom is interested in is 60s music, those kinds of music. But when her mom was alive, George is not really interested in those things. And she's quite indifferent, in fact, because she's a teenager, she has her own interests. So yeah, it's not like she's expected to share every single interest with her mom. But because of her mom's death, she's trying to kind of, try to cherish everything or anything that she's able to kind of salvage, every little bit of memory, in order to kind of have this remembrance of her mom in her head. And she does that by actually getting more into these classical paintings, and she is also kind of trying to explore the 60s music that she thinks her mom listened to when she was alive. So that is kind of like really interesting, because it is a really specific description of how a person deals with grief. And it's really I'm pretty sure there are other people in real life who does this similar thing as well, but it just feels so specific to George, with the kinds of art form that she's looking for in order to remember her mom. And it's just so nice and kind of inspiring, kind of heartwarming in a way. And at the same time, we also have this subplot where George is forming a friendship with another girl at her school, and that girl is someone who is kind of different from her. She has a very strong personality. Her name is Helena, and she's not the kind of person who gets bullied. In fact, she helps George when George herself gets bullied. And they form this friendship, and it is in this friendship that George actually, is able to process better, like process the grief that she has. This relationship is kind of really interesting. It has different layers. So you would have to read the story to know that layer. I think it's really fun for me. And it is also in this part of the story, this part of the subplot, where we see this friggin' cover image comes into play into this story. And I just want to say a little bit about this image. I didn't know what it was, and as it turns out, it is actually the image of two 60s francophone singers, and they are Sylvie Vartan, and she's the one who is blonde, and the brunette one is actually Françoise Hardy. So these were singers, these were like celebrities, and something that made me feel really stupid is that there's actually a description of this image at the back of this book, partially covered by this price tag. So that's the thing about this image. It was something that really mystified me about this book, and once I knew about what this image was, that mystique actually kind of went away, worn off a little bit, but it still feels really interesting. Now, I was just only talking about the first part of this book. The second part of this book actually concerns an Italian painter who was from the Renaissance era. Now, these two parts are really interconnected to each other. In the first part, George's part, which takes place during the current time, there's this one bit where George and her mom actually visits the one place in Italy. It's called, I think, Palazzo Schifanoia, and that's where they saw some painting together. But at that time, George was not really feeling those paintings, because those paintings were the stuff that her mom was interested in, and she was just bringing her kids there to enjoy it with them, but they didn't like super enjoy or appreciate those paintings. Just to give you a little bit of taste, we have those bit of paintings inside this cover of the book. So a little bit here as well, kind of nice stuff, really nice details. I was also quite intrigued by these paintings, and I didn't know what they were before I look up on Palazzo Schifanoia. But as it turns out, those were the paintings from that place, the fresco painting. But anyway, the paintings in Palazzo Schifanoia was actually kind of, some of them were painted by this painter named Francesco del Cosa, and he's actually a real painter from history in real life. But we have a fictionalized story of that painter in this book. Now, this second part about Del Cosa, the painter, is kind of interesting also, but it's a little bit difficult for me because the writing was a little bit experimental, it was a little bit unconventional, and it definitely took some time for me to digest. And the story itself, it's also quite nice. It's about this painter and how he as a child until he grows up, how he has this really nice parents, and how he becomes a painter, how he strikes this friendship with another guy who soon becomes his kind of friend, and how he receives inspiration to paint when he visits a brothel, and also what his experience was while he was kind of painting at the place that would later become the Palazzo Schifanoia, which would later be visited by George and her mom. So those are the details we see in the second part of the book. But those were actually the flashback in this part. Now, the present of the second part of this book is actually the same present that happened concurrently with the present of George's part, and I think that part is really interesting. And you might be wondering how that can be so. when you have this character who is a dead character, a dead Italian painter? And the answer is because he actually kind of, at the start of his section of the story, ascends from heaven, and no, he descends from heaven, and he kind of finds himself at this purgatory-like place where he starts to kind of tell us his story about his life, all of these flashbacks that I mentioned earlier. And at the same time, he was observing George in real life. And he's actually observing all of the things that George is doing in the first part of this book. So we kind of see a reinterpretation of the scenes in the first part of this book through Del Cosa's eyes. So I think that's really neat. It's wonderful, and it was really fun to read, especially when you get to those details where he's describing various sorts of artwork, art forms in our modern times, like photographs, how he praised the details of the painting in such a way that they are so lifelike and all that. And he's also describing how George is listening to music through her earphones, and how she's dancing. And he's also describing George using the electronic device to watch porn. Yeah, there's actually a part where George watched porn in this book. And also he also describes how George is using the camera and all that. So it's really interesting. I really loved it. So those are the two parts of this book. And I later found out that this book was actually published in a different alternate kind of order, and different editions of this book would actually have those two parts reversed. So you can actually get this book in both editions, like one with the George story first, another one with the Del Cosa story first. And I find this kind of interesting because these two parts, when you read them, they actually do not occur like one after another. In fact, they actually occur at the same time. So it's kind of interesting because you don't have to consider like this event caused another. They're kind of like fresco painting, where you have like paintings on top of another painting. It's interesting in that way, kind of relates to Del Cosa's painting and all that. So yeah, it has this like really, I think, this really neat way of expressing the story, where instead of getting something that is linear, we get something that is overlapping, but because it's in written form, of course the written form cannot be overlapped with each other, like literally. So when you think of it this way, it's like it's really nice. It's interesting. And maybe if you decide to get yourself this book, you'll get a different order than mine, and perhaps your reading experience will be different. I always wonder, if I were to get that edition instead, how would my experience be? Starting with the part that I considered a bit more challenging, the Del Cosa part, and move on to George part. I wonder how that would affect my reading experience. And honestly, I have no idea, because there is no way I'm able to erase my memory on my first reading of this book. But yeah, it's really something interesting to just think about. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I talked so much about this book, but I think it just comes down to one thing. This book is wow. I love it. And if you ever had the chance of reading this book, you should totally read it. I'm pretty sure there are, of course, other people who find this book to be not so fun, and I understand why they feel that way. And this book is certainly not for everybody, but I certainly think that it is something worth trying, because I think that it has so much heart into it. And yeah, one thing that I want to mention is this is also the book that kind of, the kind of book that would, that would have pushed me to make a booktube channel. So yeah, what I mean by that is, this is the kind of book that when I read it, I just had this like really strong itch to talk about this book with someone, or to at least express my my thoughts about it, like this really strong desire to talk about this book. And I think booktube is an outlet for that. And finally I have this probably long video, rave video about this book. But yeah, this is also another book that something that I must admit I did not understand 100%. I did not get the details in this book 100%. But despite that, I am happy to say that I just love it so much, because even though I did not get everything on my first reading, I am still able to get enough heart and enough experience that makes me feel so much love towards it. And with more reading, or with more rumination, or even with more research, reading about other people's reviews and experience, my feeling towards this book, it keeps on evolving, it keeps growing, it's always in the constant of state of flux. So it's not something that I read and I thought, oh, that's it, it's good, it's awesome. But for me, this book is like, I read it and I was like, wow. And then I thought about something, and I had another realization, and I realized that I like this book more. And then I read other people's experience about this book, and I thought, well, I never thought of that, and I would like it more. So that is my experience with this book. I'm curious to see if everyone else have different kinds of experience, or if they have this kind of experience with different books as well. I have a feeling that I'm not alone, feeling that way. But yeah, this book, it's wonderful. That's why I gave it 5 stars, and everyone should read it. So that's it for my book talk on Alice Smith's How to Be Both, and I guess I'll see you again in a different video. That's pretty much the end of my raving. Everyone take care, and I'll see you again. Bye, and have a good one.